I didn't know answers. I want to stop and hear what you have to say. Yeah?
How would you explain that other countries like Colombia are pushing for a free trade agreement? I mean, with the consequences, I mean, it's kind of evident that NAFTA hasn't delivered. So why are these countries after free trade agreements?
Well, there's the cynical answer, and there's the optimistic answer. The cynical answer is that elites want to join the Pan-American elite, and that closer economic integration is the best way to do that. The best way to get out from under various forms of capital controls and have the United States property law regime kind of ruling throughout the hemisphere, and the best way, to say make it likely that your great-grandchildren can live in New York or Los Angeles or Miami for life if they want to. The kind of closer economic integration is almost surely a good bet for the rich elite in any country if you look forward to a wave of possible futures, in many of which Miami or Los Angeles or New York is a very nice place to live vis-a-vis other options. The way this is put in China is that every rich family in China wants to have at least one cousin in the United States in case you have to flee in the Learjet or the rubber boat. And they may. The last century and a half of political instability is truly remarkable. The optimistic answer is that the wave of U.S. politics is already moving in a protectionist direction. And to try to sneak in, the gate may come down, the United States may cease being the importer of last resort for the world. And if that comes to pass, it's much better to be inside the gates than outside. And here I think Latin American countries are harking back to the experience of Argentina during the Great Depression. The Argentinian economy in the 70 years before 1929 had been built on extremely close integration with Great Britain, but Argentina had been part of Britain's informal economic rather than of its formal political empire. So when the Great Depression comes, Great Britain slams on imperial preference, which means that everything Argentina exports, and that Canada exports, and that Australia exports, and that New Zealand exports, and that South Africa exports. Well, all of a sudden, they tell Argentina, you can sell what's left over after we've taken what the Dominions want to sell to us. And that being outside Britain's political empire, right, with nothing to restrain Britain from its policies of imperial preference, it devastated the Argentine economy in the 1930s, and then led as part of a political reaction to Peronist policies of self-sufficiency in the 1940s and 50s, which meant that Argentina then missed out on the greatest export-led boom the world economy had ever seen, and so got run over coming and going by British tariffs in the 1930s and then by not trying to export in the 1950s. And I think it's that belief, right, that successfully concluding a free trade agreement of the Americas would provide an important piece of insurance against, say, Senator Schumer of New York. And it may well come down. That it's hard to imagine textile imports in the U.S. remaining as free as they are now for much longer. Yeah?
I guess there's a difference between saying that NAFTA hasn't brought massive economic growth and saying that on the other hand NAFTA has been bad for economic growth. So I guess if you should choose between having a country with a poor education system, rising inequality and free trade, and a country with a poor education system, rising inequality without free trade, I guess what do you choose the former?
Well, I think that let me for the moment channel Harley. It's not here. All right, let me channel Harley. And Harley Shaken would say that that's not the choice. Right? The choice is between a Mexico that pursues a social investment and high education agenda in the 1990s, or a Mexico that pursues a neoliberal free trade agenda. You have only so much political, right? You only have so much political capital, and you can either follow the road of Salinas de Gortari or the road of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, and the road Cardenas looks a lot more attractive even to the roads like me now than it would look 14 years ago. The second problem is Iowa, right? You go to Iowa. It's one gigantic corn and pig farm. It's one gigantic high-tech corn and pig farm. It produces corn and pigs at an efficiency that the world has never before seen. And that would have struck all previous, that back to the first days that the first guy in Europe managed to catch a boar or a sow and say, hey, this is a good thing. Or back to the first days when Mexico managed to find this strange plant called teosinte and said, hey, we can do something with this. They would not have believed what's been made of Iowa. And free trade, the fact that the North American Free Trade Agreement was phrased not as America does a favor to Mexico by promising never to raise tariffs against Mexico again, but as a free trade agreement between two countries on formally equal levels of power. And there were important reasons for doing it that way. Very important symbolic and also important institutional reasons. But what this meant is that not only can Mexican producers export manufactured goods to America, and also fruits and vegetables during the few months when it's too rainy in California to harvest much, but also that Iowa can export corn to Mexico. And originally, if I remember correctly, the original draft of NAFTA had a special 10-year exemption for imports of corn. And when Lloyd Bentsen came in as Treasury Secretary, his first question about NAFTA was, why only 10 years? Why not 2 generations? Did the Bush administration people negotiating this realize exactly how potentially dangerous it is if you consider a Mexico which still has a large number of near-subsistence corn farmers relying on the ability to sell their corn in the market in order to purchase what they need to keep their farms running? Are they aware of how dangerous subjecting them to sudden competition from Iowa kind of would be? And we called them up and asked them and found that no, indeed, they hadn't. And in the end, it went forward, right? Lloyd Bentsen opining that he didn't think that he thought Mexican governments would take full advantage of this. And that certainly there was now established in the U.S. Treasury an institutional memory that perhaps this carve-out for corn should be extended, right, in the event that it turned out to be a source of trouble. Yet the Zedillo government, it dropped tariffs on imports of corn much faster than it was required to under NAFTA. In large part because cheap corn for urban workers and voters is a powerful plus, no matter what it's doing to people out in the countryside. So I think that one effect of NAFTA has been to put visible downward pressure on the price of corn flour in Mexico, right? In Mexico, which is something everyone living in the cities loves, but also to greatly accelerate migration from the countryside to Mexico and to impoverish the countryside something, which is seen as an indirect effect, not the result of NAFTA, but instead other broader processes. So there are, in my mind at least, kind of serious worries about how large the negative of subjecting Mexico's near-subsistence rural agriculture to competition from Iowa have been. But I can't say that that I have any reason to do more than be fearful. Yeah?
Corn, though, is highly subsidized in this country, and the subsidies have increased. So
Yes.
in '92, you didn't really know how the subsidies were going to be restructured, and how large they were going to be.
Well,
And if the corn was not dumped at below the cost of production, things would have been a little bit better. Measured that.
Yeah. Although Peter Lindert from Davis would say that if there's one iron law that the true iron law of economics is that subsidies per farmer increase as the farming sector shrinks. Now, it is true that American farmers are now receiving more in government subsidies than they are making in farm value added, and are doing so in direct contraversion of all the political science theories of interest group power. Right? They have extremely low power. There aren't very many of them. I mean, there are fewer farmers and farm laborers in America than there are gardeners and groundskeepers and growers of ornamental plants. And yet, the one thing that no one takes on, the one political interest that no one takes on, is farm subsidies. Right? The only one who made a serious try was Newt Gingrich in one of his few adventures among the children of light. And yet even that was more than totally reversed as soon as he let it sleep. And so it means that we should head on over to sociology or anthropology and talk about the Neolithic Revolution and how a very deep structure of our culture is that the farmer is somehow superior. Perhaps to the cowman and certainly to the lawyer, and so deserving of protection against the market. But I think we should have known that there were going to be big U.S. export subsidies, or big U.S. subsidies attached to agriculture, because there are, and likely they will, for quite a long time. Yeah?
I just had a good question. I was intrigued by your third point as one of the reasons that, that the educational infrastructure in Mexico is anchoring or slowing down growth in Mexico. Okay. Assuming that that's true, is there a way that Mexico can invest in their infrastructure while kind of assuaging inflation fears for investors?
I don't know. I mean, I would say that's beyond my competence. I would think that doing as much as you can to decentralize education. Right? That education works much, much better when people at the township level are hiring the teachers rather than people at the provincial level who need to find a job for someone's feckless cousin. But that's beyond my competence. Harley? I've channeled you. I have said that you would say that the political energy that went into free trade would have been much, much better employed in the late 1990s, being focused for Mexico on improve the education system and invest in social capital agenda, rather than a free trade and North American integration agenda.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. You channeled me correctly. And in fact, I think that Mexico is paying a price for that now in terms of social capital, in terms of its ability, now that it is engaged with China in a way that's fundamentally different than what was the case when the NAFTA debate took place.
We recently had an event at class at which David Bonnier argued that the main failure of NAFTA was that it hadn't included a European-style cooperation and regional transfer component. I was wondering what your response to that argument would be.
I think it's wonderful to have David Bonnier saying things like that, rather than the only thing we import from Mexicans is hepatitis via strawberries. Which was what David Bonnier was in, and I ran into him back in 1993. Yeah. My fears are ferocious then. Yeah, that if you're going to if you're going to try to integrate two economies where labor productivity levels differ by a factor of 5, it seems to be much, much better to do it in, the European-style way, in which you focus a lot on social adjustment and development funds, right? Rather than to simply say, okay, blow the whistle and let the market rip. I'd say that was definitely the true, and I would say that the Clinton administration had somewhat of a bad conscience about this back in 1993. Witness, say, when Congress